I was standing in my own kitchen at 9 in the morning, still in my nightgown, when my daughter Jessica walked in and said the words that would change everything between us forever. "Mom, you need to stay upstairs tonight. We're having people over, and honestly, it would be weird having you around." She didn't even look at me when she said it, just grabbed her protein shake from the fridge like she'd asked me to water her plants. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stood there holding my coffee mug, the steam rising between us, and for a moment I thought I'd misheard her. Stay upstairs? In my own house? But Jessica was already scrolling through her phone, probably texting her boyfriend Marcus about party logistics, and she waved her hand dismissively without lifting her eyes from the screen. "It's just for one night, Mom. You won't even notice. We'll keep the music down." That's when I realized my 32-year-old daughter, who had moved back in with me 6 months ago after losing her marketing job, thought she could banish me to the second floor of the house I'd been paying for since before she was born. The house where I'd raised her alone after her father walked out when she was 3. The house where I'd worked double shifts at the diner and weekend cleaning jobs just to keep the mortgage current and food on the table. My name is Dorothy Chen, and at 67 years old, I thought I'd earned the right to move freely through my own home without asking permission from anyone, especially not from the daughter I'd sacrificed everything to raise. But as I watched Jessica lean against my kitchen counter like she owned the place, thumbs flying across her phone screen while completely ignoring the woman who'd given her life, I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd become invisible in my own story. The house sat on Maple Street in the suburbs of Portland, a modest 2-story colonial that I'd bought in 1985 with a down payment scraped together from tips and overtime hours. The mortgage had finally been paid off 3 years ago, and I'd cried that day, sitting alone at this same kitchen table, because there was no one left to celebrate with. My parents were gone, I'd never remarried, and Jessica had been living in Seattle then, too busy with her career to return phone calls, let alone visit her aging mother. Now she was back, but not because she missed me or wanted to spend time together. She was back because her startup company had folded, her apartment lease had expired, and she needed somewhere to land while she figured out her next move. She'd arrived in February with 3 suitcases and an attitude that suggested she was doing me a favor by gracing me with her presence. "It'll just be temporary, Mom," she'd said that first night, already rearranging my living room furniture to accommodate her yoga mat and meditation cushions, "just until I get back on my feet. You know how tough the job market is right now." But 6 months had turned into a routine where I cooked her meals, did her laundry, and watched her treat my home like her personal hotel while she spent her days networking at coffee shops and her evenings going out with friends who never seemed to acknowledge that I existed. The changes had been gradual at first. Jessica would suggest that maybe I should go to bed earlier because she needed to take important calls in the living room. She'd rearrange the pantry because my system didn't make sense to her. She'd invite Marcus over for dinner without asking, then act surprised when I'd already prepared something different. Slowly but surely, I'd found myself adjusting my schedule, my habits, even my presence in common areas to accommodate her preferences. But this morning felt different. This morning, she wasn't just suggesting I modify my routine. She was telling me to disappear entirely. And as I stood there in my faded blue nightgown, feeling smaller than I had in years, I wondered when exactly I'd allowed my own daughter to start treating me like an inconvenience rather than the woman who'd given her everything. Jessica finally looked up from her phone, and for a moment, I hoped she might realize how her words had landed, might apologize, or at least acknowledge that she was asking something unreasonable. Instead, she smiled that bright, practiced smile she'd perfected during her corporate days and said, "Oh, and could you maybe park your car on the street tonight? Marcus is bringing some friends, and we'll need the driveway space." My car, the 2018 Honda Civic I'd saved for 2 years to buy, trading in the ancient Corolla that had finally given up after 15 years of faithful service. The car I'd purchased outright, with cash, because I'd learned long ago that monthly payments were a luxury I couldn't afford. She wanted me to park it on the street so her boyfriend's friends could use my driveway. "Jessica," I said, setting my mug down carefully because my hands had started to shake with something that wasn't quite anger yet, but was heading in that direction. "This is my house. I live here. I've lived here for almost 40 years. She looked at me like I was being unreasonable, like I was the one asking for something outrageous. "I know that, Mom. And I appreciate everything you've done for me, I really do. But this party is important for my networking. There might be potential employers there. People who could help me get back into the industry." "One night, Mom. I'm asking for one night." The networking excuse, of course. Everything Jessica did these days was for networking, for making connections, for advancing her career. Even when she'd moved back home, she'd framed it as a strategic decision rather than acknowledging that she needed help. She couldn't just ask her mother for support. She had to turn it into a business arrangement, a temporary inconvenience that would ultimately benefit her professional development. I'd seen this before. This ability she had to reframe any situation so that she was the one making sacrifices, the one deserving of sympathy. When she'd quit her job at the marketing firm last year, it wasn't because she'd been struggling with performance reviews and missed deadlines. It was because she was ready for a new challenge and wanted to explore entrepreneurial opportunities. When her startup failed, it wasn't because her business plan had been unrealistic and her funding had dried up. It was because the market wasn't ready for innovation and investors were too risk-averse. Now she was reframing her request to exile me from my own living space as a favor I could do for her career advancement. And the scary part was, I could feel myself almost considering it, almost nodding along with her logic, almost convincing myself that maybe it would be easier to just go upstairs for one evening rather than cause a confrontation. But then I looked around my kitchen, really looked at it, and saw how much had already changed since she'd moved in. The ceramic rooster collection that had sat on the windowsill for 20 years was gone, relegated to a box in the basement because Jessica said it was too country for her aesthetic. The family photos that had covered the refrigerator door had been replaced with her meal prep schedule and yoga class calendar. Even my favorite coffee mug, the one my coworkers had given me when I retired from the diner, had been pushed to the back of the cabinet to make room for her collection of protein shake bottles. When had I become a guest in my own home? When had I started apologizing for taking up space in rooms I'd been furnishing since before she was born? When had I allowed my own daughter to start treating me like an elderly relative who needed to be managed rather than the woman who'd worked 3 jobs to put her through college? "No," I said quietly, and the word hung in the air between us like something fragile and dangerous. Jessica's head snapped up from her phone, eyebrows raised, in genuine surprise. "What?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I said no. I'm not staying upstairs in my own house so you can throw a party. If you want to have people over, that's fine, but I'm not hiding in my bedroom like I'm some embarrassing secret you need to keep from your friends. Jessica's expression shifted from surprise to irritation, the same look she'd worn as a teenager whenever I'd refused to let her do something she considered reasonable. "Mom, don't be dramatic. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm just asking you to give us some space for one evening. It's not that big of a deal." Not that big of a deal. Easy for her to say. She wasn't the one being asked to disappear from her own living room, her own kitchen, her own life. She wasn't the one who'd spent the last 6 months gradually surrendering control of her own space to someone who acted like they were doing her a favor by being there. I'd been quiet for so long, accommodating for so many months, that I'd almost forgotten what my own voice sounded like when it said no. But standing there in my nightgown, looking at my daughter who was already turning back to her phone like the conversation was over. I felt something shift inside me. Something that had been sleeping for a very long time suddenly woke up. "Actually, Jessica, it is a big deal," I said. And this time my voice was steadier, stronger. "This is my house. I've worked my entire life to keep this roof over our heads, and I'm not going to be banished to the attic like some fairy tale character just because you want to impress people who probably won't even remember your name next week." The reference to the attic was intentional. The third floor of our house had been converted into storage space years ago, accessible only by a narrow pull-down ladder filled with Christmas decorations and boxes of Jessica's childhood belongings that she'd never bothered to sort through. It was dusty, hot in summer, cold in winter, and definitely not suitable for human habitation. But the way she'd been talking, I wouldn't have been surprised if that's where she expected me to spend the evening. Jessica finally put her phone down and looked at me with the kind of exaggerated patience she might show to a difficult customer. "Okay, Mom, I get that you're upset, but you're making this into something it's not. I'm not trying to kick you out of your own house. I'm just asking for a little consideration. You go to bed early anyway, so what's the difference if you go upstairs at 8 instead of 10? "What's the difference?" The difference was that it was my choice when to go to bed in my own home. The difference was that I'd spent 32 years making sacrifices for her, and now that she was an adult, she was still expecting me to rearrange my life for her convenience. The difference was that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being her mother and started being her accommodating roommate. I opened my mouth to explain this to her, to help her understand why her request felt like such a betrayal, but she was already gathering her things to leave for the day. Yoga class, probably, or another networking coffee meeting with someone who might have job leads. She paused at the kitchen door and turned back with that bright, professional smile again. "Think about it, okay? The party starts at 7, so if you could just head upstairs around 6:30, that would be perfect. And Mom, maybe wear headphones if you want to watch TV. Sound carries in this old house." Then she was gone, her footsteps echoing through the front hallway, the door closing behind her with a finality that felt like a verdict. I stood alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd built with my own hands, and realized that my daughter saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to be managed. But what Jessica didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know because I'd never told anyone, was that 3 weeks ago, my life had changed in a way that meant I never had to be anyone's obstacle ever again. 3 weeks ago, I'd checked the numbers on my lottery ticket and discovered that Dorothy Chen, the woman who'd spent 40 years serving coffee and cleaning other people's houses, was now worth more money than she could spend in several lifetimes. The ticket was still in my purse, unclaimed, because I'd been trying to figure out what winning meant, how it would change things, whether I even wanted it to change things. I'd been living with this secret, this impossible reality, while Jessica treated me like a burden in my own home. But now, standing in my kitchen, wearing my old nightgown, while my daughter demanded I make myself invisible for her convenience, I finally understood what I wanted to do with my windfall. I wanted to remind my daughter exactly who she was talking to, and I wanted to do it in a way she'd never forget. The morning passed slowly after Jessica left. I moved through my usual routine, making my bed, tidying the living room, preparing lunch for one because Jessica rarely ate at home anymore. But underneath the familiar rhythm of these daily tasks, something new was building. Not anger exactly, though there was definitely some of that. Not hurt, though that was there too. It was something more like clarity, like the feeling of finally seeing a picture that had been out of focus for so long you'd forgotten it was supposed to be sharp. I'd been making excuses for Jessica's behavior for months, telling myself she was stressed about her career, that moving back home was hard for someone her age, that she didn't mean to be dismissive or demanding. I'd been so grateful to have her in the house again, so happy not to be eating dinner alone every night, that I'd overlooked how quickly she'd taken over my space and started treating me like hired help rather than family. But the party request had stripped away all my rationalizations and forced me to see the truth. My daughter didn't respect me. She saw me as a convenience, a free place to stay and a person to manage household logistics while she focused on more important things. She'd moved into my home and immediately started rearranging it to suit her preferences, assuming I'd be grateful for any attention she gave me, even if it came with conditions and demands. The worst part was that she was probably right to assume I'd go along with it. For 6 months, I had been going along with it. I'd been so afraid of conflict, so desperate to maintain our relationship, that I'd let her walk all over me. I'd convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than keeping my dignity. But now I had options I'd never had before. Now I had the kind of financial freedom that meant I could make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. And what I wanted, I realized as I sat at my kitchen table with my afternoon tea, was to show my daughter what respect looked like. The lottery ticket was in my purse, folded carefully inside my wallet behind my driver's license. $47 million after taxes. I'd checked the numbers so many times I had them memorized, had visited the lottery website so often I could navigate it with my eyes closed. But I hadn't told anyone, hadn't claimed the prize, hadn't even allowed myself to fully believe it was real. I'd bought the ticket on a whim 3 weeks ago, using the numbers from my birthday, Jessica's birthday, and the day I'd bought this house. $5 that had seemed like a luxury at the time, money I probably should have saved or spent on groceries. But it had been payday, and I'd been feeling optimistic about something, though I couldn't remember what now. When the numbers were announced 2 days later, I'd checked my ticket while drinking my morning coffee, expecting to see nothing, the way I had every week for the past 10 years. Instead, I'd seen 5 matching numbers staring back at me, and my first thought hadn't been excitement or joy. It had been terror. Pure, breathless terror at the idea that my life could change so completely, so suddenly, that I might lose the small, predictable world I'd built for myself. I'd hidden the ticket and tried to pretend it hadn't happened. I'd gone to the grocery store, cleaned the house, made dinner for Jessica and Marcus, and acted like Dorothy Chen was still the same woman she'd been the day before. But underneath the surface, I'd been processing what it meant to suddenly have more money than I'd ever dreamed of, more security than I'd ever thought possible, more freedom than I'd ever known how to use. The freedom was the part that scared me most. For 40 years, every decision I'd made had been constrained by financial necessity. Work jobs I didn't love because I needed health insurance. Drive used cars because new ones were too expensive. Skip vacations because the money needed to go toward the mortgage. Live carefully, save constantly, and always worry about what would happen if something went wrong. Now, suddenly, I could do anything, go anywhere, buy anything. And the possibilities were so overwhelming that I'd frozen completely, unable to move forward with claiming the prize because I couldn't figure out what I wanted my new life to look like. But Jessica's party demand had given me clarity. I didn't need to redesign my entire existence overnight. I just needed to stop letting people treat me like I didn't matter, starting with my own daughter. And I was beginning to form an idea about exactly how to do that. The phone rang just after lunch, pulling me out of my planning. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, calling to ask if I'd heard about all the cars that would be parked on our street tonight for Jessica's party. Apparently, Jessica had already started spreading the word around the neighborhood, letting people know there might be some congestion and asking for patience. "She's such a thoughtful girl," Mrs. Patterson said, and I could hear the approval in her voice. "Always thinking ahead, always so considerate. You raised her right, Dorothy." I listened to my neighbor praise my daughter's consideration while staring at the kitchen counter where Jessica had left her breakfast dishes for me to clean up, the way she did every morning. Thoughtful, considerate, right. "Yes," I said carefully. "She's certainly got everything planned out." After I hung up, I sat for a while longer, thinking about perception and reality. about the image Jessica projected to the world versus the way she actually behaved behind closed doors. She was good at managing her reputation, good at making sure other people saw her as responsible and caring. But she'd gotten sloppy with me, assuming that I'd never challenge her behavior, never demand better treatment. Tonight, she was going to learn that assumptions could be dangerous things. I spent the afternoon researching luxury hotels in downtown Portland, the kind of places I'd driven past 1,000 times but never dreamed of entering. The Heathman Hotel, with its afternoon tea service and marble lobby. The Nines, with its rooftop restaurant and panoramic city views. The Portland Harbor Hotel, with its spa services and concierge staff trained to cater to every whim. I wasn't planning to spend the night at any of these places. I was planning something much more interesting than that. But I wanted to understand what real luxury looked like, what kind of service $47 million could buy, what it felt like to be treated like someone who mattered. By the time Jessica came home at 5:30, her arms full of shopping, bags from the expensive grocery store downtown, I was ready for her. I'd showered and dressed carefully in my best slacks and blouse, had done my hair and even applied a little makeup. I looked like someone going somewhere important, which was exactly the image I wanted to project. Jessica barely glanced at me as she rushed into the kitchen and started unpacking ingredients for what looked like an elaborate spread of appetizers. Imported cheeses, organic vegetables, bottles of wine that probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week. All purchased, no doubt, with the credit card she'd asked to borrow money to pay off just last month. "Oh, good. You're dressed up," she said, still not really looking at me. "That means you're planning to go upstairs soon, right? People will start arriving in an hour, and I really need to get everything set up." I watched her arrange expensive olives in small ceramic bowls, her movements quick and efficient, her attention completely focused on creating the perfect party atmosphere. She'd put on a black dress that I'd never seen before, probably purchased. Today, along with all the food. Her hair was styled in loose waves, her makeup professionally applied. She looked beautiful, successful, like someone who belonged in magazine spreads about sophisticated entertaining. But she was creating this perfect image with my money, in my house, while asking me to disappear so I wouldn't interfere with the illusion she was trying to maintain. And suddenly, I understood something I'd been missing for months. Jessica wasn't just inconsiderate. She was ashamed of me. She was ashamed of her 67-year-old mother with her discount store clothes, and her practical haircut, and her history of working blue-collar jobs to keep food on the table. She wanted the benefits of living in my house, but she didn't want her new professional contacts to see where those benefits came from. She wanted to present herself as sophisticated and independent, not as someone who'd had to move back in with her mother because her startup had failed. "Actually, Jessica," I said, and something in my tone made her finally look up from her olive arrangements. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the way they did when she sensed resistance. "What kind of misunderstanding?" "I'm not going upstairs tonight. This is my house, and I plan to spend the evening exactly where I always do. In my living room, watching my television, in my own home." The silence that followed was sharp and electric. Jessica stood perfectly still behind the kitchen island, a bowl of olives in her hands, staring at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. Then she set the bowl down carefully and walked around the counter until she was standing directly in front of me. "Mom," she said, and her voice had that careful, controlled quality it took on when she was trying to manage a difficult situation. "We talked about this morning. You said you'd think about it, and I assumed that meant you'd realized it was the reasonable thing to do." "I did think about it," I replied, maintaining eye contact even though every instinct I had was telling me to back down, to apologize, to make this easier for her. And I realized that the reasonable thing to do is stand up for myself in my own home. Jessica's face flushed, and for a moment I saw the teenager she'd been, furious at being told, no, ready to escalate until she got her way. I paid the admission fee without checking how much it cost, a small act of rebellion that felt both thrilling and strange. The exhibits traced the history of Oregon from Native American settlements through pioneer expansion, logging boom, and modern development. I moved slowly through the displays, reading every placard, studying every photograph, absorbing stories of people who had built lives in this place through determination, hard work, and sometimes just dumb luck. People who had started with nothing and created something lasting. People who had faced impossible choices and found ways to survive them. In the section about Portland during the Great Depression, I found myself staring at a photograph of women working in a commercial laundry, their faces serious and focused as they bent over massive industrial machines. They looked tired, but determined, like people who understood that survival meant showing up every day regardless of how they felt about it. They looked like me, I realized, like the woman I'd been for most of my adult life. But they also looked like people who had believed in something beyond just getting through the day. They looked like people who thought their work mattered, who saw themselves as part of something larger than their individual struggles. When had I stopped feeling that way about my own life? When had I started seeing myself as someone who endured rather than someone who contributed? A young woman in a museum volunteer vest approached me as I stood studying the photograph. "That's one of my favorite pieces in the collection," she said. "Those women were supporting entire families during some of the hardest economic times in the country's history. They kept whole communities functioning through sheer determination." "They look so strong," I said, surprised to hear my own voice speaking to a stranger about something that wasn't weather or grocery prices. They were. Women like that didn't have the luxury of giving up, so they found ways to keep going even when everything seemed impossible. There's something really inspiring about that kind of resilience. Resilience. I turned the word over in my mind as I finished walking through the museum. Was that what I'd been demonstrating all these years? Or had I just been hiding? Was there a difference between enduring hardship and accepting disrespect? Between being strong and being a pushover? By the time I left the museum, the sun was setting and downtown Portland was transitioning into its evening rhythm. Restaurants were filling up with dinner crowds, bars were hosting happy hour gatherings, theaters were preparing for evening performances. The city felt alive with possibilities, with people making choices about how to spend their time, their money, their energy. I walked back to my car slowly, thinking about choice and possibility, and the difference between surviving and living. For 40 years, I'd been focused on survival, making sure there was food on the table, keeping the mortgage current, ensuring Jessica had what she needed for school and activities, and eventually college. I'd been so busy taking care of everyone else's needs that I'd forgotten to consider what I might want for myself. But now, suddenly, survival wasn't the only option. Now I could think about what I actually wanted, what would make me happy, what kind of life I wanted to build with the time I had left. And the first thing I wanted was to stop being invisible in my own story. When I reached my car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine, watching the city lights begin to twinkle as darkness settled over the downtown area. Somewhere across town, Jessica's party was probably in full swing. Young professionals were networking, making connections, building careers while sipping wine purchased with money they hadn't earned. And Jessica was playing hostess in my house, basking in compliments about her entertaining skills while carefully avoiding any mention of whose home was making it all possible. But I wasn't thinking about Jessica anymore. I was thinking about the women in that photograph, the ones who had faced impossible circumstances and found ways to not just survive, but thrive. I was thinking about resilience and strength and the difference between being needed and being valued. And I was thinking about what it might feel like to walk into a room and have people notice me not because I was serving them or cleaning up after them, but because I was someone worth noticing. I started the car and began driving toward home, but not because I was ready to apologize or accommodate or make things easier for my daughter. I was driving home because I was ready to reclaim my space, to stop accepting less than I deserved, to become the kind of woman who demanded respect rather than begging for scraps of attention. The house was blazing with lights when I pulled onto Maple Street, and the entire block was lined with cars exactly as Mrs. Patterson had warned me. It would be. Expensive cars mostly. BMWs and Audis and sleek sedans that cost more than I used to make in a year. The kind of cars driven by people who had never had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries, who had never had to work multiple jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. I parked on the street 3 blocks away and walked back toward my house, listening to the sound of laughter and conversation drifting through the windows. The front porch was decorated with string lights I'd never seen before, and through the large picture window I could see groups of people standing around with wine glasses, looking exactly like the sophisticated professional gathering Jessica had promised to deliver. But as I stood on the sidewalk looking at my own home, I realized something that made my chest tight with an emotion I couldn't quite name. This wasn't Jessica's party. This was my house being used as a backdrop for Jessica's performance. Every light that was shining, every room that was being enjoyed, every comfort that was being provided had been paid for by my 40 years of work. But none of the people inside knew that, because Jessica had edited me out of the story completely. I walked around to the backyard where I knew I could enter through the kitchen door without having to navigate through the crowd. The kitchen was empty, except for platters of half-eaten appetizers and empty wine bottles, evidence of a successful party, but also of the mess I'd probably be expected to clean up tomorrow while Jessica slept off her networking hangover. From D. The kitchen, I could hear the party conversation clearly. Jessica's voice rose above the others periodically, telling stories, making jokes, positioning herself as the center of attention. I caught fragments of what she was saying as I stood there listening. "Oh, this place? I've been renovating it slowly, trying to bring it into the 21st century. It's got good bones, but you know how these older houses can be. Renovating. It. As if the 38 years I'd spent maintaining and improving this house were nothing more than outdated choices she was graciously correcting. As if every improvement, every repair, every careful decision I'd made about paint colors and furniture and landscaping had been waiting for her sophisticated eye to set things right. I heard someone compliment the wine selection and Jessica's laugh as she replied, "I try to keep a well-stocked cellar. Life's too short for cheap wine, don't you think?" My wine cellar, the small basement storage area where I kept the few bottles I bought for special occasions, supplemented apparently by whatever expensive selections Jessica had purchased for tonight's event. But in her telling, it became evidence of her refined taste rather than my modest attempt to have something nice on hand for celebrations. The conversation shifted to career discussions, and I heard Jessica holding forth about her entrepreneurial experience, the lessons she'd learned from her startup's failure, her plans for re-entering the corporate world with new perspective and maturity. She sounded confident, articulate, like someone who had learned from setbacks and was ready to apply that knowledge to future success. But then she took a breath and tried a different approach, the one that had been working on me for months. "Look, I understand why you might feel like I'm being unfair, but this really is important for my career. These aren't just random people coming over to party. These are potential employers, people who could help me get back on my feet. And having my mother hovering around, no offense, isn't exactly the professional image I'm trying to project." There it was. The truth, finally, spoken out loud. She was ashamed of me and she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. In her mind, I was an embarrassment, a reminder of failure, something that needed to be hidden away so she could pretend to be someone she wasn't. "I see," I said quietly. "So, I'm an embarrassment to you." "That's not what I said." "It's exactly what you said. You don't want your professional contacts to see your mother because it would damage your image. You want to present yourself as independent and successful, not as someone who had to move back home because she couldn't make it on her own." Jessica's mouth opened and closed a few times before she found her voice again. "That's not fair, Mom. You know this is just temporary. I'm working really hard to get back into the industry, and networking is part of that process. I can't help it if having family around makes things more complicated." More complicated. That's what I was to her. A complication to be managed. A problem to be solved. An obstacle to be moved out of the way when it became inconvenient. Not the woman who'd raised her alone, who'd worked multiple jobs to pay for her education, who'd sacrificed her own dreams so Jessica could pursue hers. But what Jessica didn't realize was that I was done being moved. I was done being managed. And I was done making myself smaller so she could feel bigger. "Well then," I said, picking up my purse from the counter where I'd placed it strategically, "I guess we have a problem, because I'm not going anywhere." Jessica stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her running through her options, trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation. Finally, she threw her hands up in exasperation. "Fine, fine. If you want to embarrass yourself and sabotage my career, that's your choice. But don't blame me when people think you're some pathetic old woman who can't give her adult daughter any space." And that's when I smiled. Really smiled, for the first time in months, because she'd just given me the perfect opening for what I'd been planning all afternoon. "Oh, Jessica," I said, slinging my purse over my shoulder and heading toward the front door. "I think you're going to be surprised by exactly what kind of woman your mother turns out to be." I drove through downtown Portland with no particular destination in mind, just the need to be anywhere except in that house watching my daughter prepare to erase me from my own life. The late afternoon sun filtered through my windshield as I navigated streets I'd driven thousands of times before, but today everything looked different. Today I was seeing the city through the eyes of someone who had options, someone who could afford to make choices based on desire rather than necessity. The lottery ticket felt like it was burning a hole in my purse on the passenger seat. $47 million. And I was driving around in my Honda Civic like nothing had changed. But everything had changed, even if I was the only one who knew it yet. The question was what I wanted to do with that change, how I wanted to use this impossible gift I'd been given. I pulled into the parking lot of Pioneer Courthouse Square and sat for a moment, watching people hurry past on their way home from work or out for evening plans. Young professionals in expensive suits, college students with backpacks, families with children who looked tired from a long day of activities. All of them living their lives, making their plans, assuming tomorrow would be more or less like today. But tomorrow, if I decided to claim my prize, nothing would ever be the same again. Dorothy Chen, who had spent 40 years counting every penny, would become Dorothy Chen who never had to worry about money again. The woman who shopped sales and clipped coupons would become someone who could buy anything she wanted without checking. The price tag first. The thought should have been exhilarating. Instead, it was terrifying in a way I hadn't expected. Money meant freedom, but freedom meant responsibility. Responsibility for making choices I'd never had to make before, for becoming someone I'd never had the chance to be. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that transformation, wasn't sure I even knew who that person would be. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica. "Where did you go? People are starting to arrive and your car isn't in the driveway. Please, don't make this harder than it needs to be." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling the familiar tug of guilt and obligation that had governed so much of my relationship with my daughter. She was stressed, she needed this networking opportunity, she was working hard to rebuild her career after a setback. Shouldn't I be supportive? Shouldn't I want to help her succeed, even if it meant swallowing my pride for one evening? But then, I remembered the look on her face when she'd called me a pathetic old woman, the casual cruelty in her voice when she'd suggested I was sabotaging her career by existing in my own home. And I realized that helping Jessica succeed had somehow become synonymous with making myself disappear, with accepting less and less respect in exchange for her continued presence in my life. When had I become so desperate for my daughter's approval that I'd forgotten to require hers in return? When had I started believing that being needed was the same thing as being valued? When had I convinced myself that love meant accepting whatever, scraps of attention she was willing to give me, regardless of how those scraps were delivered? I typed back a simple response. I'm fine. Enjoy your party. Then I turned off my phone and slipped it into my purse next to the lottery ticket that was going to change everything. The Oregon Historical Society was just a few blocks away, and I found myself walking toward it without any conscious decision to do so. I'd always meant to visit, had driven past the building hundreds of times over the years, and told myself I'd go someday when I had time, when I could afford the admission fee, when I wasn't working or cleaning or taking care of some other person's needs. The security guard at the front desk looked surprised to see someone my age arriving so close to closing time, but he smiled warmly and told me I had about an hour before they started shutting down for the evening. But what she didn't mention was that her ability to take time for reflection and career planning was entirely dependent on having a free place to live, free food to eat, and a mother who asked for nothing in return except basic respect. She didn't. Mention that her sophisticated entertaining was happening in someone else's house, funded by someone else's money, while that someone else was asked to make herself invisible so as not to interfere with the illusion. I stood in my own kitchen feeling like a ghost haunting my own life, listening to my daughter present herself as independent and successful while carefully concealing the support system that made that presentation possible. And I realized that this wasn't just about one party or one evening of being asked to stay upstairs. This was about a fundamental lack of respect that had been building for months, maybe years. Jessica had learned to take me for granted so completely that she'd forgotten I was a person with my own needs, my own dignity, my own right to be acknowledged and valued. In her mind, I had become a service provider rather than a mother, someone whose job was to facilitate her success rather than someone deserving of consideration in return. But what Jessica didn't know was that the service provider was about to become someone else entirely. Someone who didn't need to worry about mortgage, payments or grocery budgets or whether the car would pass inspection this year. Someone who could make choices based on what she wanted rather than what she could afford. Someone who could demand respect rather than hoping for it. I pulled the lottery ticket out of my purse and looked at it again. Those 6 numbers that were going to transform everything. Tomorrow, I could walk into the lottery office and begin the process of claiming my prize. Tomorrow, I could start becoming someone Jessica had never met before, her mother with options. But tonight, I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be with those options. Did I want to be someone who used wealth to punish people who had hurt me? Someone who held financial power over others the way others had held it over me? Or did I want to be someone who used freedom to build something better, to create the kind of relationships I'd always wanted but never felt secure? Enough to demand? A burst of laughter from the living room interrupted my thoughts, followed by Jessica's voice saying, "Oh, that reminds me of this hilarious story about my mother." And I realized I didn't want to hear whatever story she was about to tell. Didn't want to know how she was portraying me to these strangers. Didn't want to discover what role I played in the narrative she'd constructed about her life. Because whatever that story was, it wouldn't be about the woman who had worked 3 jobs to keep this house, who had sacrificed her own dreams to fund Jessica's education, who had opened her home when Jessica needed somewhere to land. It would be about someone convenient and forgettable, someone who existed on the margins of Jessica's real life. Someone whose purpose was to provide background support while staying carefully out of the spotlight. I folded the lottery ticket and put it back in my purse, then walked quietly up the back staircase to my bedroom, not because Jessica had asked me to, not because I was accommodating her request, but because I needed time to think without the soundtrack of her performance downstairs. My bedroom felt like a sanctuary after the emotional chaos of the day. The same furniture I'd been sleeping with for 15 years, the same family photos on the dresser, the same view of the backyard garden I'd planted and maintained season after season. This was my space, The one room in the house that Jessica hadn't tried to reorganize or improve, probably because she never spent any time here. I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to imagine what my life might look like 6 months from now, a year from now, if I claimed the lottery prize. I could travel anywhere I wanted, see places I'd only read about in books or seen in movies. I could buy a different house, something smaller and more manageable, or something larger and more luxurious. I could quit worrying about retirement savings and healthcare costs and whether the roof would need replacing in the next few years. But more than that, I could stop being afraid. Afraid of conflict, afraid of asking for too much, afraid of being too expensive or too demanding or too much trouble. I could start expecting to be treated well, start requiring respect rather than hoping for it, start building relationships based on mutual consideration rather than my willingness to accept whatever was offered. The party noise continued below. Me, voices rising and falling in the rhythm of successful socializing. Jessica would probably consider tonight a triumph, would measure its success by the business cards she collected and the follow-up meetings she scheduled. She would congratulate herself on her networking skills and her ability to present herself as a sophisticated professional worth investing in. And she would never realize that her success had come at the cost of her relationship with the one person who had always been in her corner, who had always wanted the best for her, who had always been willing to sacrifice for her happiness. She would never understand that by asking me to disappear, she had lost something that no amount of professional networking could replace. My phone buzzed with another text message. This time it was from Marcus, Jessica's boyfriend, which surprised me since he rarely communicated with me directly. "Hey, Mrs. Chen, just wanted to say thanks for letting us have people over tonight. Jessica was stressed about making a good impression, and having such a nice place to entertain really helped. You raised an amazing daughter." I stared at the message for a long time, trying to process the layers of irony embedded in his gratitude. He was thanking me for something Jessica had demanded rather than requested, appreciating a home I'd been asked to vacate, complimenting me on raising a daughter who had just finished explaining to me why my presence would be an embarrassment to her career prospects. But Marcus didn't know any of that. In his mind, I was probably a generous mother who had happily offered my home for my daughter's professional advancement, someone who was upstairs reading or watching television while giving the young people space to network and socialize. He had no idea that I'd been exiled from my own living room, that Jessica had purchased party supplies with money she'd borrowed from me, that the amazing daughter he was praising had just called me a pathetic old woman for wanting to exist in my own house. I didn't respond to his message. What could I say? That he was welcome, when I'd never been asked if he was welcome. That Jessica was amazing, when she'd just demonstrated a level of disrespect that still made my chest burn with hurt and anger. That I was happy to help when helping had somehow become synonymous with disappearing. Instead, I got ready for bed even though it was only 9 o'clock, brushing my teeth and changing into my nightgown while the party continued below. But I didn't do it because Jessica had asked me to go to bed early. I did it because I was exhausted from a day of emotional revelations, and because tomorrow was going to be the first day of whatever came next. As I lay in bed listening to the muffled sounds of conversation and laughter, I made a decision that felt both scary and liberating. Tomorrow, I was going to drive to the lottery office and begin the process of claiming my prize. Not because I wanted to punish Jessica or prove a point, but because I wanted to start living as someone who had choices rather than someone who only had obligations. And then I was going to figure out what kind of life I wanted to build with my newfound freedom. A life where I was valued rather than tolerated, where my contributions were acknowledged rather than taken for granted, where I could be generous from a position of strength rather than desperate from a position of weakness. Jessica could continue her networking and career building and sophisticated entertaining, but she was going to have to do it without using me as a prop in her performance, without demanding that I make myself invisible so she could shine brighter. She was going to have to learn to respect me if she wanted to keep me in her life, Because for the first time in 40 years, I was going to have the financial security to walk away from relationships that diminished rather than enhanced my sense of self-worth. The lottery ticket in my purse wasn't just $47 million. It was 47 million reasons to stop accepting less than I deserved. And tomorrow, I was going to start collecting on that investment. The party finally wound down around midnight, and I lay in the dark, listening to cars starting in the street, voices calling out goodbyes, the front door opening and closing as guests departed. Jessica's laugh echoed up from the front porch as she said farewell to the last groups of people, thanking them for coming, expressing hope that they'd stay in touch about potential opportunities. When the house finally fell silent, I heard Jessica and Marcus moving around downstairs, their voices low as they cleaned up glasses and plates, turned off lights, and surveyed the aftermath of their successful evening. I caught fragments of their conversation through the heating vents. "That went really well," Marcus was saying. "People seemed impressed with the setup, with your whole presentation. I think you made some good connections." "I hope so," Jessica replied. "It's so important to control the narrative when you're trying to rebuild professional relationships. People need to see you as someone who has her life together, not someone who's struggling or desperate." Controlling the narrative. That's exactly what she'd been doing, I realized. Creating a story about herself that erased any evidence of need or dependence, any suggestion that her current stability was built on someone else's foundation. And I had been the biggest threat to that narrative, the living reminder that her sophisticated independence was actually sophisticated reliance on someone she'd rather not acknowledge. I heard them making plans for tomorrow, discussing follow-up emails Jessica should send, people she should reach out to for coffee meetings, strategies for converting tonight's social connections into professional opportunities. They sounded energized, optimistic, like people who believed they were building something meaningful together. But they also sounded like people who assumed tomorrow would be more or less like today, that the foundation supporting their plans would remain stable and available indefinitely. They sounded like people who had never considered that the person providing that foundation might have her own plans, her own dreams, her own timeline for how long she was willing to be taken for granted. Eventually, their voices faded as they went to bed, Jessica in her room and Marcus in the guest room where he'd been staying more often than not lately. The house settled into the deep quiet of late night, the kind of silence that makes everything feel both peaceful and loaded with possibility. I lay awake for a long time after that, not because I was upset or angry, but because I was planning how to claim my lottery prize, planning what to do with the freedom that money would provide, planning how to rebuild my relationship with my daughter from a position of strength rather than desperation. Because that's what I realized. I wanted most. Not to lose Jessica, but to find a way to love her without losing myself in the process. To be generous without being exploited, supportive without being invisible, helpful without being taken for granted. The lottery ticket was going to make all of that possible. But first, I had to be brave enough to use it. I woke up at 6 a.m. to the sound of Jessica's alarm going off downstairs, followed by the familiar routine of her morning workout playlist. The bass line thumped through the floor of my bedroom as she went through her yoga routine, in what used to be my peaceful living room. Even after a night of entertaining, even after staying up past midnight cleaning up from her party, she was back to her regular schedule as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. At least, for me. I lay in bed listening to her music and realized that I was hearing it differently now, not as background noise I had to tolerate, but as evidence of how completely she'd taken over my space. When had I stopped thinking of the living room as mine, and started thinking of it as hers to use however she wanted? I got dressed quietly and made my way downstairs, where Jessica was in warrior pose on the yoga mat she'd positioned directly in front of the television. She glanced up as I entered the kitchen, but didn't pause her routine or turn down the music. Just a quick nod of acknowledgement before returning to her stretches, as if the conversation we'd had yesterday had never happened. The kitchen was immaculate. Jessica and Marcus had done a thorough job of cleaning up after the party, washing glasses and putting away leftover food, wiping down counters and sweeping the floor. It looked exactly like it had before they'd started preparing, except for one thing. The expensive wine bottles lined up on the counter, empty but displayed like trophies. I counted 8 bottles, each one probably costing more than I used to spend on groceries in a week. The labels were elegant, sophisticated, the kind of wine served at high-end restaurants and corporate events. Wine that Jessica had purchased to impress people she barely knew, using money she'd borrowed from me to buy groceries just 3 weeks ago. As I made my coffee, I did some quick mental math. The wine alone had probably cost more than $300, not counting the imported cheeses, organic vegetables, and gourmet crackers she'd bought to go with it. Money she didn't have, money she'd somehow found for impressing virtual strangers while still owing me for basic living expenses. But it wasn't really about the money, I realized as I stood there sipping my coffee while Jessica moved through her sun salutations. It was about priorities. It was about what she considered important enough to invest in versus what she considered acceptable to take for granted. She would spend hundreds of dollars on wine to impress potential employers, but she wouldn't spend 5 minutes considering whether her request to banish me from my own living room might be hurtful or unreasonable. When Jessica finished her workout, she rolled up her mat and finally turned off the music. "Morning, Mom," she said, slightly out of breath but energized in the way people get after exercise. "Thanks for being flexible about last night. It really meant a lot." Being flexible. That's how she was choosing to frame what had happened, as if I'd graciously accommodated her request rather than been hurt and frustrated by her demand. As if my absence from my own home had been a generous gift rather than something she'd tried to extract through guilt and manipulation. "How did it go?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral while I tested how she would characterize the evening. "Really well. I made some great connections, got a couple of leads on potential opportunities. People were impressed with the setup, the food, the whole atmosphere. It felt good to be able to entertain properly for once. For once, as if she'd been living in substandard conditions before last night, as if she hadn't been enjoying the comfort and convenience of my home for the past 6 months, without contributing anything to its maintenance or upkeep, as if entertaining in my house with my dishes and my furniture was somehow a personal achievement, rather than a privilege she'd been taking for granted. "I'm glad it was successful," I said, and meant it. I did want Jessica to succeed, did want her to find meaningful work and rebuild her career. What I didn't want was for her success to come at the cost of my dignity or her respect for me as a person. Jessica poured herself a glass of the green smoothie she made every morning. The expensive protein powder and organic fruits another small luxury she'd somehow found room for in her budget, while claiming she couldn't afford to contribute to household expenses. "I should hear back from a couple of people this week," she continued, scrolling through her phone as she talked. "There's a consulting firm downtown that might have some contract work available, and one of the women I met last night is starting a new marketing agency. It's exactly the kind of opportunity I've been looking for." She sounded hopeful, energized, like someone who believed good things were finally starting to happen for her. And I found myself genuinely happy for her optimism, even as I struggled with hurt feelings about how she'd achieved it. Success built on ignoring other people's needs wasn't really success at all, but Jessica didn't seem to see the connection between her networking triumph and the cost it had extracted from our relationship. "That sounds promising," I said, refilling my coffee cup while I tried to figure out how to broach the topic I'd been thinking about all night. "Jessica, I want to talk about what happened yesterday." She looked up from her phone with a slight frown, as if she couldn't imagine what there was to discuss. "What about it?" "About you asking me to stay upstairs during your party, about the way you spoke to me when I said I wasn't comfortable with that request." Jessica set down her smoothie and gave me the kind of patient look she might give to a child who is making a big deal out of something trivial. "Mom, I thought we worked that out. You decided to give me some space. The party went well. Everyone was happy. What's the problem? Everyone was happy. Except me, apparently. But my happiness didn't seem to factor into her calculation of whether the evening had been successful. In her mind, the only feelings that mattered were hers and those of her guests. My discomfort with being exiled from my own home was just an obstacle that had been successfully managed. The problem is that this is my house, Jessica. I've lived here for almost 40 years, and I don't think it's reasonable for you to ask me to hide in my bedroom so you can impress people who don't even know I exist. Jessica's expression shifted from patience to irritation, the same look she'd worn as a teenager whenever I'd tried to impose rules she didn't like. I wasn't asking you to hide, Mom. I was asking for a little consideration, a little understanding of what I'm trying to accomplish here. Is it really so unreasonable to want some space to network without having to worry about family dynamics? Family dynamics. That's what I was to her now. Not a person with legitimate feelings, but a complication that made her professional life more difficult. Not someone deserving of respect and consideration, but an obstacle to be managed when it became inconvenient. What you're trying to accomplish, I said carefully, is rebuild your career after your business failed. I understand that, and I want to support you. But supporting you doesn't mean I have to make myself invisible in my own home. The words hung in the air between us, harder and more direct than I usually allowed myself to be. Jessica's face flushed, and I could see her struggling to find a response that would make me the unreasonable one, rather than acknowledging that my objection might be valid. That's not fair, she said finally. You know I'm grateful for everything you've done for me. But this is temporary, Mom. I'm working really hard to get back on my feet, and having a little family drama right now would be really unhelpful. Family drama. She was framing my request for basic respect as drama, as if standing up for myself in my own home was somehow creating unnecessary conflict rather than responding to disrespect she'd already shown me. I took a breath and tried a different approach. Jessica, do you think it's possible that you've gotten so focused on your own needs that you've stopped considering mine? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked a few times, as if the concept of my having needs that might conflict with hers had never occurred to her. Then she shook her head, not in denial, but in frustration. What needs, Mom? You have everything you want. You have your house, your routine, you're comfortable, retirement. I'm the one who's struggling here. I'm the one who needs support right now. Can't you just be patient for a little while longer until I get back on my feet? My comfortable retirement, my routine. As if my life was so settled and satisfied that I couldn't possibly have legitimate complaints about being treated poorly. As if being older meant I should automatically be content with whatever consideration she was willing to offer, rather than expecting to be treated as an equal partner in our relationship. But what struck me most was her assumption that she was the only one in our family who had struggles, who had needs, who deserved consideration and support. In her mind, I was a stable, comfortable resource, rather than a person with my own challenges and disappointments and hopes for how I wanted to be treated. I have been patient, Jessica. For 6 months, I've adjusted my routine, shared my space, and asked for very little in return. But yesterday, when you told me I was an embarrassment to your career and called me a pathetic old woman, that crossed a line for me. Jessica's face went pale, and for a moment I thought she might actually apologize, might acknowledge that her words had been cruel and unnecessary. But instead, she doubled down. I was stressed, Mom. I said some things I didn't mean because I was worried about making a good impression. You know how important this networking opportunity was for me, and you were making it more complicated than it needed to be. I was making it complicated by existing in my own home, by having feelings about being dismissed and insulted, by failing to gracefully accept being treated as an inconvenience rather than a person. In Jessica's worldview, my hurt feelings were the problem, not the behavior that had caused them. I see, I said quietly, and I really did see. I saw that Jessica had become so accustomed to my accommodation, so used to my willingness to absorb whatever treatment she offered, that she genuinely believed I was being unreasonable by asking for something different. Jessica must have heard something in my tone that worried her, because she tried to soften her approach. Look, Mom, I know you're upset, and I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings. But you have to understand the position I'm in. I'm trying to rebuild my entire career from scratch, and that means making some sacrifices, asking for some understanding from the people who care about me. Asking for understanding. But she wasn't asking, she was demanding. And the understanding she wanted was entirely one-directional, flowing from me to her without any reciprocal consideration of what I might need or want or deserve. I do understand your position, I said. But I don't think you understand mine. Jessica looked genuinely confused, as if my having a position was a new and unexpected development. What position? What are you talking about? And that's when I realized how completely she'd stopped seeing me as a whole person with my own interior life, my own challenges, my own right to dignity and respect. In her mind, I was a supporting character in her story rather than the protagonist of my own, someone whose job was to facilitate her success rather than someone pursuing my own goals and happiness. Never mind, I said, finishing my coffee and rinsing the mug in the sink. I need to run some errands today. I'll probably be out for most of the afternoon. Jessica nodded absently, already returning to her phone and whatever follow-up communications she was planning to send to last night's contacts. She didn't ask what errands I was running or whether I needed any help with them, didn't offer to handle any household tasks while I was out, didn't seem curious about what I might be doing with my time when it wasn't devoted to making her life easier. I went upstairs to get my purse and jacket, and that's when I pulled out the lottery ticket. One more time. Those 6 numbers that were going to change everything, that were going to transform me from someone who had to accept whatever treatment was offered into someone who could demand better. But looking at the ticket, I realized that the money itself wasn't really the point. The point was what the money represented. Freedom to make choices based on my own values rather than my financial limitations. Security to stand up for myself without worrying about the consequences. Power to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than my desperate need to be needed. Jessica had gotten comfortable treating me poorly because she assumed I had no other options. No ability to walk away from a relationship that had become unbalanced and disrespectful. She assumed that my love for her meant I would accept whatever, scraps of consideration she was willing to offer, that my need for family connection meant I would tolerate being diminished and dismissed. But what if those assumptions were wrong? What if I suddenly had the financial security to prioritize my own dignity over keeping the peace? What if I could afford to demand respect rather than hoping for it? I tucked the lottery ticket back into my wallet and headed downstairs. Jessica was in the living room now, laptop open, probably sending thank you emails to last night's contacts. She looked up as I passed through the room but didn't say anything, just gave me a distracted smile, before returning to her screen. I'll see you later, I said, and she nodded without really listening, already absorbed in crafting whatever message she thought would best advance her professional prospects. I drove toward downtown Portland with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. The Oregon Lottery office was located in a nondescript building near the river, the kind of place you might drive past 100 times without noticing. But today it felt like the most important destination in the city, the place where Dorothy Chen would stop being someone who accepted whatever treatment was offered and start being someone who could afford to expect better. The parking lot was nearly empty at 9 in the morning, just a few cars belonging to employees and one other person who looked like they might be there for the same reason I was. An older man in a baseball cap and windbreaker, clutching an envelope and looking simultaneously excited and terrified. Inside, the office was surprisingly ordinary. Fluorescent lights, industrial carpeting, a few chairs arranged around a small waiting area. It looked more like a DMV than the place where lives were transformed by impossible luck. But the woman behind the counter smiled warmly when I approached, as if she was genuinely happy to see me. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" I pulled the lottery ticket out of my wallet, my hands steadier than I'd expected them to be. "I think I need to claim a prize." She took the ticket and scanned it with a handheld device, and I watched her eyes widen as the numbers registered. "Oh my," she said softly. "Oh my goodness. Ma'am, you're going to need to speak with our prize claim supervisor. This is a very significant win. A very significant win. $47 million, which was more money than everyone in my family had earned combined over the past 3 generations. More money than I could spend. More security than I'd ever dared to dream about. More freedom than I'd ever thought possible." The supervisor, a kind-faced woman named Patricia, led me into a small office and explained the claiming process. There would be paperwork, identity verification, decisions about how I wanted to receive the money, lump sum or annuity payments, tax withholding, media disclosure policies, a dozen choices I'd never had to consider before, all of them carrying consequences I was only beginning to understand. "This is a life-changing amount of money," Patricia said gently. "We always recommend that winners take some time to process what this means before making any major decisions. Do you have financial advisors, lawyers, people you trust to help you navigate this transition?" I thought about her question. Did I have people I trusted? Jessica was the closest person in my life, but our conversation this morning had made it clear that she saw me primarily as a resource rather than a person. My few remaining friends were acquaintances from work or neighbors I chatted with occasionally, not people I felt comfortable sharing life-altering news with. "Not really," I admitted. "It's mostly just me." Patricia nodded understandingly. "That's actually pretty common. Many winners find that sudden wealth changes their relationships in unexpected ways. We have resources to help with that, financial planners and counselors who specialize in helping people adjust to significant windfalls. Changing relationships in unexpected ways. I wondered what Patricia would think if I told her that my primary relationship was already so damaged that financial independence felt more like an escape route than a complication. We spent the next 2 hours going through paperwork, verifying my identity, discussing my options for receiving the money. I chose the lump sum payment, partly because I didn't trust myself not to doubt the reality of the win if I had to wait for annual payments, and partly because I wanted the full power of my new financial position available immediately. "The money will be transferred to your designated account within 10 business days, Patricia explained. "In the meantime, I'd strongly recommend opening a new account specifically for this purpose, possibly at a different bank from your current one. And please, be very careful about who you tell. This kind of news has a way of attracting attention you might not want." I promised to be discreet, though I wondered who I would tell even if I wanted to. Jessica, eventually, but not until I'd figured out how to use this news to rebuild our relationship on more equitable terms. My neighbors, maybe, if I decided to move somewhere smaller and more manageable. But mostly, I realized, I wanted to keep this secret for a while, to have time to adjust to this new reality before dealing with other people's reactions to it. When I left the lottery office, I felt simultaneously lighter and heavier than I had in years. Lighter because the financial worries that had governed my decision-making for 4 decades were suddenly gone. Heavier because I now had to figure out what kind of person I wanted to be when money was no longer a constraint on my choices. I drove to the Pearl District, one of Portland's most upscale neighborhoods, and parked on a tree-lined street filled with art galleries, boutique shops, and expensive restaurants. This was the kind of area I'd always admired from a distance but never felt comfortable exploring, partly because I couldn't afford most of what was for sale here, and partly because places like this made me feel conspicuous and out of place. But today, I walked through the district like I belonged there, looking in shop windows without checking price tags first, considering purchases based on whether I liked something rather than whether I could afford it. I didn't buy anything, wasn't ready for that level of commitment to my new reality yet, but I practiced feeling like someone who could. In a high-end furniture store, I found myself studying a beautiful dining room set, solid wood with elegant lines and craftsmanship that would last for generations. The kind of furniture I'd always admired but dismissed as impractical, too expensive, not meant for people like me. "It's gorgeous, isn't it?" the salesperson said, approaching with the kind of attentive smile that suggested she thought I might actually be a potential customer. Handcrafted by artisans in North Carolina, made from sustainably harvested hardwood, it's an investment piece, something you'd pass down to your children. An investment piece. Something I'd pass down to Jessica, if we could figure out how to rebuild a relationship worth preserving. Something that would outlast both of us, that would still be beautiful and functional long after our current conflicts were forgotten. "How much?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. $15,000 for the complete set. Table, 6 chairs, and the matching sideboard. $15,000. 6 months ago, that would have represented more money than I had in my savings account. Today, it was less than I'd probably earn in interest in a single day once my lottery winnings were invested. The shift in perspective was so dramatic it made me feel slightly dizzy. "I'll think about it," I said. Though what I was really thinking about was how different it felt to consider a purchase like this from a position of choice rather than impossibility. How different it felt to walk through the world as someone who could afford nice things rather than someone who had to make do with whatever was cheapest. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring neighborhoods I'd only driven through before, looking at houses in the hills with panoramic city views, stopping in cafes where a single lunch cost more than I used to spend on groceries for 3 days. Not because I wanted to move to the hills or eat expensive lunches regularly, but because I wanted to understand what options looked like when money wasn't the primary constraint. By the time I drove home, the sun was setting and I felt like I'd spent the day in a parallel universe, one where Dorothy Chen was someone who mattered, someone whose preferences and desires were worth considering, someone who didn't have to accept whatever treatment other people were willing to offer. The house was quiet when I entered through the front door. Jessica's car was in the driveway, but I didn't hear her usual sounds of activity. No music, no phone conversations, no laptop typing. I found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a thoughtful expression. "Hey, Mom," she said when I entered. "How were your errands?" Something in her tone was different, softer, like she'd been thinking about our conversation this morning and perhaps regretting some of what she'd said. Or maybe I was just hearing her differently, now that I knew I had the financial security to demand better treatment if she wasn't willing to offer it voluntarily. "Fine," I said, hanging my jacket on the back of a chair. "How was your day? Any responses to your follow-up emails?" "A few. Nothing concrete yet, but some promising. Conversations. These things take time." She paused, studying my face. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said this morning, about feeling like I don't consider your needs." I waited, curious to see where this was heading. Was she actually ready to acknowledge that her behavior had been problematic, or was this another attempt to manage me into accepting the status quo? "I think maybe I have been taking you for granted," she continued. "Having somewhere comfortable to stay while I rebuild my career, not having to worry about rent or utilities, having someone to share meals with. I know it's been an adjustment for you too, having me back in the house after so many years of living alone." It was a start, I realized, not a full acknowledgement of how dismissive and disrespectful she'd been, but at least a recognition that my experience of our living arrangement might be different from hers, at least an admission that she'd been taking more than she'd been giving. "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully. "It has been an adjustment." Jessica nodded, looking uncomfortable but determined to continue. I was thinking maybe we could establish some better boundaries, some clearer expectations about how to share the space. I don't want you to feel like a guest in your own home. Better boundaries, clearer expectations. The language of negotiation, rather than demand, of mutual consideration rather than unilateral decision-making. It was progress, though I wondered whether this new approach would last beyond whatever guilt she was currently feeling about our morning conversation. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. "Well, maybe we could set up a schedule for entertaining, so you're not surprised when I need to have people over. And maybe I could contribute more to household expenses, help with groceries and utilities. I know money's been tight since you retired, and I don't want to be a burden. Money's been tight since I retired. If only she knew that as of this morning. Money would never be tight for me again. That as of 10 business days from now, I would have more financial security than anyone in our family had ever dreamed of. That her offer to help with utilities was touching but unnecessary, like offering to help someone who had just discovered oil in their backyard. But I wasn't ready to share that information yet. First, I wanted to see whether Jessica could learn to treat me with respect for reasons that had nothing to do with my financial status. I wanted to know whether she could value me as a person rather than just as someone who was useful to her, whether she could build a relationship based on genuine caring rather than convenience and necessity. "That sounds like a good start," I said. "I'd like to feel more like we're partners in making this living arrangement work rather than feeling like I'm just accommodating your needs." Jessica smiled, the first genuine smile she'd given me in weeks. "I'd like that too. I'm sorry if I've been selfish, Mom. Starting over in your 30s is harder than I expected. And I think I've been so focused on trying to rebuild my career that I forgot to pay attention to how my choices were affecting you." Starting over in your 30s. I wondered what she would think if she knew that I was about to start over in my 60s, that I was planning a reinvention that would be far more dramatic than anything she was contemplating. That while she was trying to rebuild a career, I was preparing to completely reimagine what my life could look like when financial constraints were no longer a factor. "We all get focused on our own challenges sometimes," I said. "The important thing is that we're talking about it now." We spent the next hour having the kind of conversation we should have been having months ago, discussing practical arrangements for sharing the house, acknowledging each other's needs and preferences, establishing the mutual respect that should have been the foundation of our relationship from the beginning. But underneath my relief at this improved communication, I was also making plans. Plans for how to reveal my lottery win in a way that would strengthen rather than complicate our newly repaired relationship. Plans for using my financial freedom to build the kind of life I'd always wanted, but never felt secure enough to pursue. Plans for becoming the kind of person who commanded respect rather than hoping for it. Jessica didn't know it yet, but our conversation about better boundaries was about to become much more interesting. Because starting tomorrow, I was going to be someone with options she couldn't imagine. Someone who could afford to walk away from any relationship that didn't serve me well. Someone who would never again have to choose between financial security and personal dignity. The lottery ticket had given me more than money. It had given me the power to become the mother I'd always wanted to be, the woman I'd always wanted to be, the person who could love Jessica without losing herself in the process. And that transformation was about to begin. 3 days later, I was standing in the private banking office of First National Bank downtown, watching a young financial advisor named Michael review documents that represented more money than most people would see in several lifetimes. The lottery commission had moved faster than expected, and my account now showed a balance that still made me feel slightly nauseous when I looked at it directly. "Mrs. Chen," Michael was saying, his voice carefully professional despite the obvious excitement in his eyes. "Given the size of this deposit, we're going to recommend moving most of it into diversified investment portfolios immediately. Even conservative investments should generate more income than most people's full-time salaries." More income than most people's salaries. I thought about Jessica, frantically networking and sending follow-up emails, stressing about making the right impression on potential employers who might offer her a job paying $60,000 or $70,000 a year. Meanwhile, I was sitting in a mahogany-paneled office, learning that my money would probably earn more than that while I slept. "I'd like to keep some readily accessible," I said, surprised by how easily I was adapting to conversations about millions of dollars. "Maybe 2 million in accounts I can access quickly if needed." Michael nodded as if requests for immediate access to $2 million were perfectly routine. "Of course. We can set up several high-yield savings accounts and money market funds that will give you liquidity while still earning significant returns. And we'll want to discuss tax planning, estate planning, philanthropic strategies if you're interested in charitable giving." Charitable giving, estate planning, the language of people who had more money than they could spend, who had to think carefully about how to distribute wealth rather than how to accumulate it. I was entering a world I'd only read about in magazines, becoming someone I'd never imagined I could be. "There's one other thing," I said, pulling out the folder I'd prepared. "I want to set up some specific arrangements, educational trusts, maybe some investment accounts for family members. But I want to control how and when the money becomes available." Michael's expression became more attentive. "Certainly. We have extensive experience with family wealth management. Are you thinking about gifts or more structured arrangements that include conditions and timelines?" "Structured arrangements," I said firmly. "I want to be able to help family members, but I want to ensure the money is used wisely, that it enhances rather than replaces their own efforts." What I didn't tell Michael was that I was thinking specifically about Jessica, about how to use my newfound wealth to support her career goals without enabling the entitled behavior that had been damaging our relationship. I wanted to help her succeed, but I wanted her to understand that help came with expectations of mutual respect and consideration. After 2 hours of paperwork and planning, I left the bank feeling like a different person than the one who had entered. Not just because of the money, though that was certainly transformative, but because of the way everyone had treated me, with deference, with attention, with the assumption that my preferences and decisions mattered. I hadn't realized how long it had been since anyone had listened to me with that kind of focus. I spent the afternoon at Pioneer Place Mall, not because I needed to buy anything but because I wanted to practice being someone who could afford whatever caught my interest. I tried on clothes in stores I'd never entered before, considered jewelry that cost more than I used to make in a month, tested expensive perfumes just because I enjoyed the way they smelled. In Nordstrom, a sales associate named Sarah helped me select a complete wardrobe of clothes that actually fit well and made me look like someone who took care of herself. Not flashy or ostentatious, but well-made, elegant, appropriate for a woman who no longer had to shop sales racks and clearance bins. "You have excellent taste," Sarah said, as she rang up purchases that totaled more than $3,000. "These pieces will serve you well for years. Quality clothing is always a good investment." A good investment. Everything was an investment now, from furniture to clothing to experiences. I was learning to think like someone who could afford to buy things that would last, who could prioritize quality over price, who could make decisions based on what would serve her best rather than what was cheapest. But the most expensive thing I bought that day wasn't clothing or jewelry. It was a consultation with an interior designer named Elena Rodriguez, who specialized in helping people transform their living spaces to reflect their personal style and goals. I found her through a referral from the bank, part of their comprehensive wealth management services. "I'd like to redecorate my house," I told Elena during our initial phone conversation. "I've been living with the same furniture and arrangement for 20 years, and I think it's time for a change." Elena's enthusiasm was infectious. "How wonderful! There's nothing I love more than helping someone reimagine their space. When would you like to schedule a consultation? I could come out this weekend and we could discuss your vision." My vision. I realized I'd never thought about my house in terms of vision before, only in terms of necessity and practicality. What would it look like if I decorated based on what I loved rather than what I could afford? What kind of environment did I want to create for this new phase of my life? We scheduled the consultation for Saturday morning, which gave me 3 days to think about what I wanted my home to represent. Not just a place to sleep and store belongings, but a space that reflected who I was becoming. Someone who valued herself enough to surround herself with beauty and comfort. When I got home that evening, Jessica was in the kitchen preparing dinner, something she'd started doing since our conversation about contributing more to the household. She looked up when I entered, loaded down with shopping bags. "Wow, Mom, you've been busy. What's all this?" I set the bags down carefully, aware that they contained more new clothes than I'd bought in the previous 5 years combined. Just some shopping. I decided it was time to update my wardrobe a little. Jessica's eyebrows raised as she glanced at the store names on the bags. Nordstrom, Anthropologie, a boutique downtown whose name she probably recognized as expensive. "That's great. You deserve to treat yourself. Did you find some nice things?" "You deserve to treat yourself." The phrase struck me as both accurate and insufficient. I did deserve to treat myself, but more than that, I deserved to be treated well by other people. I deserved to expect respect and consideration rather than hoping for scraps of attention. I deserved to build my life around what made me happy rather than what made everyone else comfortable. "I did," I said. "I'm making some changes in my life, trying to focus more on what I want rather than just what's practical." Jessica smiled as she stirred whatever she was cooking. "I think that's really healthy. You spent so many years taking care of me and focusing on what I needed. It's about time you started thinking about yourself." It's about time. She was right, though she had no idea how dramatically I was preparing to rearrange my priorities. She was thinking about new clothes and maybe some updated furniture. I was thinking about fundamental transformation, about becoming someone who commanded respect rather than settled for tolerance. "I'm having an interior designer come look at the house this weekend," I said casually, testing her reaction. "I'm thinking about doing some redecorating, maybe updating some of the furniture that's been here for 20 years. Jessica paused, in her stirring, processing this information. Interior designers were expensive, the kind of service people hired when they had significant disposable income. But instead of asking how I could afford such a luxury, she seemed to assume I'd found some way to justify the expense. That sounds exciting. The house could definitely use some updating, maybe something more modern, more sophisticated. I've always thought the living room could look more elegant with the right furniture and color scheme. I've always thought. As if she'd been waiting for me to finally recognize that my decorating choices needed her approval. As if she'd been patiently tolerating my unsophisticated taste until I developed enough sense to seek professional help. "I'm looking forward to exploring some new ideas," I said neutrally, not mentioning that one of my primary goals was to create a space that felt like mine again, that reflected my preferences rather than accommodating everyone else's opinions about what would look better. We had dinner together, and Jessica told me about her job search progress, the follow-up conversations she'd been having with contacts from her networking party, the possibilities that seemed to be developing. She was optimistic, energized, like someone who believed good things were finally starting to happen for her. "There's one opportunity that seems particularly promising," she said, cutting into the chicken breast she'd prepared with herbs from the garden I'd been maintaining for 15 years. "It's a marketing director position with a nonprofit downtown. The salary isn't amazing, but it's the kind of role that could really rebuild my reputation in the industry." "That sounds wonderful," I said, and meant it. I did want Jessica to find meaningful work, did want her to rebuild her career and regain her independence. What I didn't want was for her success to continue being built on taking me for granted, on assuming I would indefinitely provide free housing and support without requiring respect in return. "The only thing is," Jessica continued, "they want someone who can start immediately, and they're looking for someone with a stable, professional image. The kind of person who looks like they have their life together, you know? I knew exactly what she meant, though I wondered if she understood the implications of what she was saying. She was worried about projecting stability and professionalism while living with her mother, worried that potential employers might see her current living situation as evidence of failure rather than as a reasonable temporary arrangement. "I'm sure you'll make a good impression," I said. "You're articulate, experienced, and professional. Any employer would be lucky to have you." Jessica smiled, but I could see the anxiety underneath her optimism. She was still struggling with the shame of having had to move back home, still worried about how her career setback would be perceived by people whose opinions mattered to her professionally. And that's when I realized that my lottery win could solve more than just my own problems. It could solve Jessica's problems too, but in a way that would require her to treat me as a partner rather than a convenient resource. I could help her achieve the independence and stability she craved. But I could structure that help in a way that rebuilt rather than damaged our relationship. "Jessica," I said carefully, "what if you didn't have to worry about your living situation affecting how employers perceive you?" She looked up from her plate, curious but not quite following my meaning. "What do you mean?" "What if you had your own place, something professional and sophisticated that reflected the image you want to project? What if you could invite potential employers over for dinner without worrying about family dynamics or whether the environment looked right?" Jessica's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Mom, I can't afford my own place right now. You know that. The job market is tough, and I need to save money until I find something permanent. I thought we'd agreed that me staying here made sense for both of us." "I'm not suggesting you move out," I said quickly. "I'm suggesting something else entirely. What if I helped you get your own place? Something nice enough to support your professional goals, as a gift to help you restart your career." The words hung in the air between us, and I watched Jessica process what I was offering. Help with an apartment wasn't a small gift. In Portland's rental market, first and last month's rent plus deposits could easily total $5,000 or $6,000. For someone in Jessica's financial position, that kind of money might as well be $1 million. "Mom, that's incredibly generous, but I can't let you do that. You're on a fixed income, and you need your savings for your own security. I can't take money you might need for emergencies or healthcare or retirement expenses." Fixed income, retirement expenses. She was still thinking of me as someone who had to count every penny, someone whose financial resources were limited and precious. She had no idea that I could now afford to buy her an apartment building, not just help with rent deposits. "What if my financial situation was different than you think?" I asked quietly. Jessica frowned, trying to interpret what I meant. "Different how?" "Mom, you worked at the diner for 20 years and did cleaning jobs on weekends. You saved what you could, but it's not like you made a fortune. You've been careful with money, but we both know there isn't much margin for big expenses." She was right about my employment history, about the careful budgeting and limited resources that had characterized most of my adult life. But she was completely wrong about my current financial situation, and I realized it was time to begin sharing the truth about how dramatically things had changed. "Jessica, I need to tell you something important, something that's going to change both of our lives in ways you can't imagine." Something in my tone must have conveyed the seriousness of what I was about to reveal, because Jessica set down her fork and gave me her full attention for the first time in months. 3 weeks ago, I won the lottery. The words sounded surreal even as I spoke them, like something that happened to other people in news stories rather than something that could happen to Dorothy Chen from Maple Street. But the bank statements in my purse, the investment accounts, being established in my name, the interior designer coming this weekend all confirmed that this impossible thing had actually occurred. Jessica stared at me for a long moment, as if she was waiting for the punchline or trying to determine whether I was having some kind of mental health episode. "You won the lottery," she repeated slowly. $47 million, after taxes. The number seemed to echo in the kitchen, too large and impossible to fully comprehend. Jessica's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice again. $47 million. Yes? You're serious? Yes. Jessica pushed back from the table and stood up, pacing to the window and back as if she needed to physically move while processing this information. When? How? Why didn't you tell me? I bought the ticket 3 weeks ago. I've been trying to process what it means, how it changes things, what I want to do with this opportunity. And I didn't tell you because I needed to understand how this news might affect our relationship. Jessica stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock, certainly, but also something that might have been hurt. You didn't trust me enough to tell me? The question struck deeper than I'd expected it to. Did I trust Jessica? I trusted her not to steal from me or deliberately hurt me. But did I trust her to be genuinely happy for my good fortune, rather than immediately calculating how it might benefit her? Did I trust her to see me as a person deserving of this stroke, of luck rather than as a resource that had suddenly become much more valuable? I needed time to figure out who I wanted to be with this money, I said honestly. And I needed to know whether you could learn to respect me for reasons that had nothing to do with what I could give you. Jessica's face flushed, and I could see her struggling with the implication of what I'd said. What does that mean? It means that for the past 6 months, you've treated me like a convenience rather than a person. You've taken my support for granted, dismissed my feelings when they conflicted with your goals, and made me feel like a burden in my own home. I needed to know whether that was going to change because you recognized it was wrong, or whether it would only change because you found out I could afford to demand better treatment. The truth hung between us, undeniable and uncomfortable. Jessica opened her mouth to protest, to defend herself, but then closed it again. Perhaps she was finally hearing how her behavior had sounded from my perspective, finally understanding why I might have hesitated to share news that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic between us. I didn't realize, she said quietly. I didn't realize I was treating you that way. I know you didn't. That's what worried me. You'd gotten so comfortable taking me for granted that you couldn't see how dismissive and disrespectful you'd become. And I was afraid that if I told you about the money first, you'd learn to treat me better for the wrong reasons. Jessica returned to her chair, moving slowly as if she was still processing the magnitude of what I'd revealed. So when you said you wanted to help me get my own place, I meant it. I can afford to help you in ways you can't imagine. I can buy you a house if that's what you want. I can support your career goals, help you start your own business, eliminate every financial worry you've ever had. But I won't do any of those things unless I'm confident that you value me as a person, not just as someone who can solve your problems. Jessica was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. I do value you, Mom. I love you. I'm grateful for everything you've done for me. I know you love me, I said gently, but love and respect aren't the same thing, and I need both if we're going to move forward together. Jessica looked up at me with tears in her eyes, and for a moment I saw not the entitled professional, who had been treating me like hired help, but the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who used to help me bake cookies on Sunday afternoons, who used to tell me I was the best mom in the world. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize how I was treating you. I was so focused on my own problems, my own stress, that I stopped thinking about how my behavior was affecting you. That's not who I want to be. The apology felt genuine in a way that her earlier attempts at reconciliation had not. This wasn't damage control or manipulation. This was recognition and regret. This was my daughter finally seeing me clearly and not liking what she observed about herself. I believe you, I said, and I want to help you. I want to use this money to build a better life for both of us. But it has to be a partnership, Jessica. It has to be based on mutual respect and consideration, not just my ability to solve your problems. Jessica nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. What do you want from me? How do I fix this? I don't want you to fix anything overnight. I want you to think about what kind of relationship you want us to have, what kind of person you want to be. And I want you to understand that having money doesn't change who I am fundamentally. I'm still your mother. I still deserve respect and consideration, and I still need to feel valued for more than what I can provide. We sat together in the kitchen as the evening light faded outside, talking more honestly than we had in years. Jessica asked questions about the lottery win, about my plans for the money, about how this would change our lives. But mostly she listened, really listened, in a way she hadn't done since moving back home. There's something else, I said as our conversation began to wind down. I'm having the house redecorated. Not just updated, but completely transformed. I want it to reflect who I'm becoming, not just who I've been. Jessica nodded slowly. That makes sense. This is a fresh start for you, isn't it? For both of us, I hope. I want to use this opportunity to build the kind of life I've always wanted but never felt secure enough to pursue. And I want to help you do the same, if you're willing to be a real partner in that process. Jessica reached across the table and took my hand, her grip warm and steady. I want that too, Mom. I want to be the daughter you deserve, not just the one you've been tolerating. And I want to learn from you, to understand what it means to be generous and strong at the same time. That night, I lay in bed thinking about transformation and second chances, about the difference between changing circumstances and changing character. The lottery money had given me options I'd never had before, but the real change was happening in my willingness to expect more from my relationships, to demand respect rather than accepting whatever consideration others were willing to offer. Jessica and I had a long way to go before we rebuilt the trust and mutual respect that should have been the foundation of our relationship all along. But for the first time in months, I felt hopeful that we were heading in the right direction, that my newfound financial security could be the catalyst for emotional healing rather than just material comfort. The next morning, Jessica was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, but instead of rushing through her morning routine while ignoring my presence, she had made coffee for both of us and was sitting at the table with a thoughtful expression. I've been thinking about what you said last night, she began as I joined her, about respect and partnership and what kind of person I want to be. And I realized I need to make some changes that have nothing to do with your lottery win. I sipped my coffee and waited, curious to see whether the previous evening's revelations had prompted genuine self-reflection or just strategic adjustment to the new reality of my financial status. I've been treating you like you existed for my convenience, she continued. Like your job was to make my life easier while I figured out my career. That's not fair, and it's not the kind of relationship I want us to have. What kind of relationship do you want us to have? Jessica considered the question carefully before answering. I want us to be friends as well as family. I want to enjoy spending time together, not just tolerate it because we live in the same house. I want to be someone you're proud of, not just someone you're supporting. Friends as well as family. The concept felt both foreign and appealing. When was the last time Jessica and I had spent time together because we enjoyed each other's company rather than because family obligation required it? When had we last had conversations about topics that interested us both rather than logistics? About household management and her job search? I'd like that too, I said. But friendship requires mutual interest and respect. It requires both people contributing to the relationship rather than one person always accommodating the other. Jessica nodded. I know, and I want to start contributing more. Not just financially, but emotionally. I want to ask about your interests, your goals, what you want to do with this new phase of your life. I realize I've been so focused on my own problems that I've forgotten you have your own dreams and preferences. My own dreams and preferences. For 40 years, my dreams had been constrained by financial necessity and responsibility for Jessica's needs. But now, suddenly, I could dream without limitations, could consider possibilities I'd never allowed myself to imagine. I'm not sure I know what my dreams are anymore, I admitted. I've been focused on survival and responsibility for so long that I've forgotten how to think about what I actually want. Then maybe we can figure that out together. Maybe part of rebuilding our relationship can be helping each other discover what we want our lives to look like. The offer felt genuine, like something offered out of love rather than obligation or strategy. And I realized that this might be the real gift of my lottery win. Not just the financial freedom to pursue my dreams, but the security to rebuild. Relationships based on choice rather than necessity, on mutual affection rather than dependence. I'd like that, I said. I'd like to rediscover who I am when I'm not worried about money, when I can make choices based on what makes me happy rather than what I can afford. Jessica smiled, and for the first time in months, it looked completely natural and unforced. Then let's start there. Let's start with figuring out what makes you happy. Over the next few hours, we had the kind of conversation I'd been hoping for since she'd moved back home. Not about logistics or problems or obligations, but about possibilities and interests and the kind of future we wanted to build together. Jessica asked questions about my childhood dreams, my interests beyond work and family responsibilities, the places I'd always wanted to visit and experiences I'd always wanted to have. And I found myself remembering aspects of my personality that had been dormant for decades, interests I'd set aside because they seemed impractical or expensive, dreams I'd abandoned because they didn't fit with the life circumstances that had constrained my choices for so long. I told her about my fascination with art history, something I'd studied briefly in community college before dropping out to work full-time, about my interest in travel, particularly to Europe and Asia, places I'd read about but never imagined I could afford to visit, about my secret desire to learn new languages, to take cooking classes, to maybe even write about some of my experiences. Jessica listened with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for networking conversations, asking follow-up questions and making connections I hadn't seen, suggesting ways my various interests might combine into meaningful pursuits. You know, she said thoughtfully, you could audit classes at the university, art history, languages, whatever interests you. Or you could travel and take cooking classes in different countries, learn about food and culture at the same time. You could. Not, maybe someday if you save enough money, or, that sounds nice but probably isn't practical. Just, you could. As if my dreams were legitimate possibilities rather than idle fantasies. I never thought about actually doing those things, I said. They always seemed like luxuries I couldn't justify. But now you can justify them. Now. You can do anything you want, Mom. Isn't that amazing? It was amazing, and also terrifying in its scope and possibility. But having Jessica's enthusiasm and support made it feel less overwhelming. More like an adventure we could explore together, rather than a transformation I had to navigate alone. What about you? I asked. If money wasn't a constraint, what would you want to do with your career? Jessica's expression grew thoughtful. Honestly, I'd want to start my own consulting firm, maybe focus on helping nonprofits with their marketing and outreach. The startup I tried to launch was too broad, too ambitious. But I have good ideas about how organizations can better connect with their communities. That sounds meaningful. What would you need to make that happen? Startup capital, mostly. Enough to cover expenses while I build a client base, maybe hire a small team eventually. And credibility, which is harder to buy. I'd need to prove I could deliver results before people would trust me with their marketing budgets. I listened to her describe her vision for her own business, and I could hear the passion in her voice that had been missing when she talked about job applications and networking events. This wasn't just about rebuilding her career. This was about creating something that mattered to her, something that aligned with her values and skills. "What if you didn't have to worry about startup capital?" I asked. Jessica looked at me, carefully, as if she was trying to determine whether I was making a serious offer or just encouraging her to dream out loud. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if I invested in your business idea? Not as a gift, but as a real investment with expectations of professional results and financial returns. What if you could focus on building something meaningful instead of just finding any job that would pay the bills?" The offer hung between us, more serious and substantial than anything I'd ever been able to propose before. Jessica stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her processing both the opportunity and the responsibility such an investment would represent. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. But it would have to be a real business arrangement, not just family help. I'd want a business plan, clear goals, regular reports on progress. I'd want to be proud of what we built together, not just proud that I helped you get started." Jessica's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they looked like tears of possibility rather than regret. "That would be incredible, Mom. That would change everything." "It would change everything for both of us. That's the point." We spent the rest of the morning sketching out ideas for how a business partnership might work, what kinds of nonprofit clients Jessica might target, how she could demonstrate her expertise and build credibility in the market. It felt like the kind of conversation I'd always hoped to have with my daughter, collaborative and creative, and based on mutual respect for each other's contributions. By the time Elena Rodriguez arrived for our interior design consultation that afternoon, Jessica and I were operating as a team in a way we hadn't for years. Jessica had insights about modern design trends that could complement my preferences for comfort and functionality. I had ideas about how different rooms could serve multiple purposes, accommodating both my need for peaceful space and her need for professional meeting areas. Elena was delighted with our collaborative approach. "It's so refreshing when family members can work together instead of pulling in different directions. This is going to be a beautiful project." As we walked through the house discussing possibilities, for each room I felt like I was seeing my home through new eyes, not just as a place that needed updating, but as a space that could reflect who I was becoming. Someone who valued beauty and comfort and quality. Someone who deserved to be surrounded by things that made her happy. "I'd like the living room to feel more sophisticated," I told Elena, "but also warm and welcoming. I want people to feel comfortable here, but I also want them to recognize that they're in the home of someone who has good taste and appreciates nice things." Elena nodded approvingly. "Exactly. We want to create a space that's elegant but not intimidating, luxurious but not ostentatious, quality pieces, beautiful fabrics, but arranged in a way that invites conversation and relaxation." Quality pieces, beautiful fabrics. The language of people who could afford to make choices based on what they loved rather than what they could afford. I was learning to think like someone who deserved nice things, someone whose preferences mattered enough to invest in realizing them. As Elena took measurements and made notes about color preferences and furniture needs, I found myself imagining the kinds of entertaining I might do in this newly elegant space. Not Jessica's networking parties where I was asked to disappear, but gatherings where I was the hostess, where people came to see me and enjoy my company and appreciate the beautiful environment I'd created. "This is going to be magnificent," Elena said as we concluded our consultation. "I'm thinking warm neutrals with sophisticated accent colors, high-quality fabrics that feel luxurious but aren't too delicate for everyday use. Furniture that's both beautiful and comfortable. Art that reflects your personality and interests." Art that reflected my personality and interests. I realized I'd never owned real art before, had never considered what kinds of visual beauty I might want to surround myself with. Another dimension of self-discovery that my lottery win had made possible. "How long will this process take?" I asked. "For a complete transformation? Probably 3 to 4 months, depending on lead times for custom pieces. But we can phase it so you're not living in chaos the entire time. Living room and dining room first, then bedrooms and other spaces. 3 to 4 months. By the time Elena finished with the house, Jessica would hopefully be well into launching her new business, and we would both be living completely different lives than the ones we'd been trapped in just a week ago. That evening, as we sat in the living room that would soon be completely transformed, Jessica and I continued planning her business venture and my personal renaissance. We researched university programs I might find interesting, discussed travel destinations that could combine my various interests, sketched out timelines for both our professional and personal goals. "You know what I realized today?" Jessica said as we were preparing to go to bed. "I've been thinking of you as my mother, but not as a whole person. I've been focused on our family relationship without considering that you have your own identity, your own dreams, your own right to pursue whatever makes you happy." It was the most insightful thing she'd said since moving back home, and it gave me hope that our relationship could evolve into something richer and more satisfying than what we'd had before. "I think we both got stuck in old patterns," I said. "But now we have a chance to build something better. Something based on who we are now, rather than who we used to be." As I lay in bed that night, I thought about revelation and transformation, about the difference between sudden change and sustainable growth. The lottery money had created the possibility for dramatic life changes, but the real transformation was happening in my willingness to expect more from my relationships, to pursue my own happiness, to become someone who commanded respect, rather than hoped for it. Jessica and I still had work to do, trust to rebuild, new patterns to establish. But for the first time since she'd moved back home, I felt optimistic about our future together. We were finally beginning to see each other clearly, to appreciate each other as individuals rather than just accepting whatever family dynamics had evolved over time. And tomorrow, I would begin the process of becoming the person I'd always had the potential to be, but had never felt secure enough to pursue. The person who deserved beautiful things, interesting experiences, and relationships built on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. The lottery ticket had been worth far more than $47 million. It had been worth my freedom. 6 months later, I stood in my completely transformed living room, watching Jessica present her business plan to a room full of potential nonprofit clients. The space Elena had created was everything I had dreamed of. Elegant, without being intimidating. Sophisticated but warm, filled with beautiful furniture and carefully chosen art that reflected my personality and interests. The woman who had once been asked to hide in her bedroom during her daughter's networking events was now hosting professional gatherings in her own beautifully appointed home. But the real transformation wasn't in the room's appearance. It was in the way Jessica introduced me to her guests, not as an inconvenience to be managed, but as her business partner and mentor. "I'd like you to meet my mother, Dorothy Chen," she said to each new arrival. "She's the investor who made this consulting firm possible, and she brings decades of business wisdom to everything we do." Business wisdom. 6 months ago, Jessica had seen me as an embarrassment to her professional image. Now she was presenting me as someone worth knowing, someone whose experience and insights added value to her enterprise. The change in her perspective had been gradual but genuine, built through months of working together as equals rather than as a dependent daughter and accommodating mother. Jessica's consulting firm, Chen Strategic Communications, had exceeded both our expectations. Her expertise in nonprofit marketing, combined with the financial stability my investment provided, had attracted clients who might never have trusted a startup operating out of someone's bedroom. Instead, they were working with a professional who could meet them in a beautiful office space we'd created in what used to be the guest room, someone who had the resources to invest in quality work rather than cutting corners to save money. The key to effective community outreach, Jessica was explaining to a group of directors from local environmental organizations, is understanding that people don't just want information. They want to feel connected to something meaningful, something that reflects their values and gives them a way to make a difference. I listened to her presentation from the kitchen, where I was preparing refreshments for the group. Not because I was relegated to catering duties, but because I enjoyed creating a welcoming atmosphere for our guests. The kitchen Elena had redesigned was a chef's dream, with professional-grade appliances and beautiful granite counters, perfect for the cooking classes I'd been taking at the Culinary Institute downtown. The cooking classes were part of my own transformation, one of many interests I'd been exploring since claiming my lottery prize. I'd also audited art history courses at the university, learning about periods and artists I'd only read about before. I'd taken a photography workshop and discovered I had an eye for capturing moments that told stories. I'd even started writing, documenting my experiences and insights about starting over later in life. But perhaps the most rewarding change was the travel. Over the past 6 months, I'd visited Paris to see the museums I'd dreamed about for decades, spent time in Tuscany learning to cook regional specialties, explored art galleries in New York and cultural sites in Japan. Each trip had expanded my understanding of the world and my place in it, reminding me that there was so much beauty and experience available to someone willing to step outside her comfort zone. The best part was that Jessica had joined me on several of these adventures, not as someone I was supporting, but as a travel companion who shared my curiosity about different cultures and experiences. We'd taken a cooking class together in Rome, where she'd been impressed by my willingness to try new techniques and flavors. We'd explored art museums in London, where my university courses helped me explain historical context while she shared insights about modern design and aesthetics. "Mom," Jessica said, appearing in the kitchen as her presentation wound down, everyone loved the proposal for the Environmental Coalition campaign. Mrs. Anderson from the Sierra Club chapter wants to schedule a follow-up meeting next week. Mrs. Anderson was exactly the kind of client we'd hoped to attract. Established, respected, with a substantial budget for professional marketing services. Landing her organization would validate everything we'd built over the past 6 months and establish our reputation in the nonprofit community. "That's wonderful," I said, arranging canapés on the serving platter I'd bought during our trip to France. "You should be proud of the work you've done building this business." "We've done," Jessica corrected. "I couldn't have accomplished any of this without your investment and support. Not just the money, though that was crucial, but your business advice and encouragement. You helped me think bigger than I would have on my own." The partnership between us had evolved into something neither of us had anticipated when I first revealed my lottery win. I wasn't just a financial backer. I was an active participant in strategic decisions, drawing on decades of experience working with people and organizations to help Jessica navigate client relationships and business challenges. My years of working multiple jobs, managing tight budgets, and dealing with difficult customers had given me insights that complemented Jessica's formal business education and marketing expertise. Together, we'd created something stronger than either of us could have built alone. "Speaking of thinking bigger," Jessica continued, "I've been considering that expansion idea we discussed. With our client base growing, we could probably support bringing on another consultant, maybe someone with fundraising expertise to complement our marketing services." Expansion. 6 months ago, Jessica had been desperately sending out resumes and hoping someone would offer her any job at all. Now she was planning to hire employees to grow a business that was already exceeding our initial projections for success. But more importantly, she was including me in those planning conversations as a full partner rather than just asking for additional funding. She valued my opinions about potential hires, sought my advice about client relationship management, respected my insights about sustainable business growth. "I think you're ready for that step," I said. "You've proven the business model works, established a reputation for quality results, and built a client base that can support additional staff. The question is whether you want to focus on growth or on deepening the services you already provide." It was the kind of strategic conversation I'd never imagined having with my daughter, the kind of professional collaboration that felt both satisfying and surprising. Jessica listened carefully to my analysis, asked thoughtful questions about the pros and cons of different expansion approaches, and genuinely seemed to value my perspective on business decisions. Our guests began leaving around 9 o'clock, each taking business cards and promising to recommend our services to other organizations in their networks. Jessica walked them to the door with the confidence of someone who knew she was providing real value, someone who had earned her professional success rather than just hoping for it. When the last guest departed, we sat in the living room with glasses of wine, reviewing how the evening had gone and planning follow-up actions for the potential new clients we'd met. "You know what I realized tonight?" Jessica said, curling up in the leather chair that had become her favorite spot in the redesigned room. 6 months ago, I was so focused on projecting an image of success that I forgot to actually build the skills and relationships that would make me successful. I was trying to look like someone who had her life together, instead of actually getting my life together. It was an insightful observation, and it highlighted how much she'd matured over the months we'd been working together. The Jessica who had demanded I disappear from my own living room had been operating from insecurity and desperation, trying to control how others perceived her rather than focusing on developing genuine competence and value. "What's different now?" I asked, though I thought I knew the answer. "Now I'm actually confident because I have reasons to be confident. I've built something real, something that helps people and generates sustainable income. I don't have to pretend to have my life together because I actually do have my life together." Jessica's business success was deeply satisfying to watch, but what made me even happier was seeing how our improved relationship had contributed to her personal growth. Having a family member who believed in her abilities, who treated her as an equal partner who expected excellence while providing support, had given her a foundation of security that allowed her to take professional risks and pursue meaningful goals. "I'm proud of you," I said. "Not just for the business success, but for the person you've become. You're generous with your clients, fair with your employees, honest about your capabilities. You've built something that reflects your values, not just your ambitions." Jessica smiled, but I could see tears gathering in her eyes. "I'm proud of you too, Mom. When I moved back home, I was so wrapped up in my own problems that I couldn't see how remarkable you are. You'd worked for 40 years to build security and stability, raised a daughter on your own, maintained this beautiful home, and I treated you like you were just there to make my life easier." The acknowledgement meant more to me than any apology could have. Jessica wasn't just sorry for how she'd treated me. She understood why her behavior had been wrong and had made lasting changes to ensure it wouldn't happen again. "We both learned something important," I said. "You learned that respect has to be earned through your actions, not demanded because of your circumstances. And I learned that I deserve to be treated well regardless of my financial situation. The lottery money had certainly made many things easier, but the real transformation had come from both of us choosing to prioritize dignity and mutual respect over convenience and accommodation. We'd built a relationship based on genuine appreciation for each other's strengths, rather than tolerance of each other's presence." "What's next for you?" Jessica asked. "You've been so focused on helping me get established, but what do you want to do with this next phase of your life?" It was a question I'd been considering more seriously lately. The business was successful, enough to run without my daily involvement. My house was exactly as I wanted it, and I'd explored many of the interests that had been dormant for decades. I was ready for new challenges, new ways to use both my financial resources and my life experience. "I've been thinking about philanthropy," I said. "Not just writing checks, but getting involved with organizations that help people transition to new phases of their lives. Maybe older women who want to start businesses, or people who need support rebuilding after major setbacks." Jessica's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "That's perfect for you. You have the financial resources to make a real impact, plus you understand what it's like to reinvent yourself when the circumstances of your life change dramatically." She was right. My lottery win had been an extreme example, but the process of figuring out who I wanted to be when my old constraints were removed was something many people faced at different points in their lives. I could help others navigate similar transitions, whether they were caused by financial windfalls, career changes, relationship shifts, or simply the decision to stop accepting less than they deserved. Maybe we could partner on some of those projects, Jessica suggested. Chen Strategic Communications could handle marketing and outreach for nonprofit organizations, while you focus on program development and direct client support. The idea of extending our partnership into philanthropic work felt like a natural evolution of everything we'd built together. We'd proven that we could work effectively as equals, that we could combine our different strengths to create something meaningful, that we could maintain family love while also maintaining professional respect. As we sat together in my beautiful living room, planning future projects and reflecting on how much our lives had changed, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with relationships and purpose, and the knowledge that I'd become the person I'd always had the potential to be. The lottery ticket had given me $47 million, but it had given me something even more valuable: the security to demand respect, the freedom to pursue my dreams, and the confidence to build relationships based on mutual appreciation rather than desperate need. Jessica had learned that success built on diminishing other people wasn't really success at all. I had learned that financial independence was meaningless without emotional independence. Together, we'd discovered that the best relationships were partnerships between equals who chose to support each other, rather than obligations between people who took each other for granted. 6 months ago, my daughter had tried to banish me to the attic during her networking party. Tonight, she'd presented me to potential clients as her business partner and mentor. The transformation had been complete, and both of our lives were immeasurably better for it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.